Hello, it's Jacob again, and we're picking up right where we left off. So, in the previous video, I introduced you to monopolies and monopsonies, situations where there is one producer or one consumer. And so, because they have no competition, they're able to choose whatever price they want. They cannot force people to buy or sell from them. And so, they cannot choose whatever quantity they want, but they're able to choose the price quantity pair that maximizes their own surplus. And as a consequence, we wind up with a situation very similar to that of the price control, where a monopoly raises the price, they put a markup on the good. This whole area between the marginal cost and the price, that would be the markup, which, due to our law of demand, will reduce quantity demanded, reducing the quantity traded. The monopolist gains at the expense of the consumer, and society as a whole is made worse off because the quantity falls. The monopolist is better off, but only because the consumer is worse off. There are unrealized gains from trade. Likewise, with the monopsony, the monopsonistic consumer lowers the price, but in doing so, they help themselves, but they harm the producer. And at a lower price, the quantity supplied is lower. So the consumer surplus goes up, producer surplus goes down, total surplus goes down. So we see the impact of a monopoly and a monopsony. But what determines market structure itself? We know that in the absence of externalities, a competitive market equilibrium is an efficient equilibrium. However, what determines when you have competition? What determines firm size? What determines the amount of entry? This is a complicated question. And one thing you'll find is that some industries hew a lot closer to perfect competition. Some are a lot closer to perfect monopoly or monopsony. Most of them are somewhere in between. Your industries that are going to be the most competitive are ones that have very similar products being sold in very large markets with tons of producers and consumers. And that mostly means raw materials and agricultural products, commodities, you would say. That mostly means global commodities markets. There are literally billions of customers for wheat, millions of producers of wheat. You're going to expect something like the global wheat trade to be damn near perfectly competitive. On the other hand, something like, say, the market for video game consoles, well, there's really only three big competitors in that, ain't there? A lot of industries actually are arranged into what's called duopolies, where you'll have two competitors, or oligopolies, where you'll have multiple competitors. We'll come back to that in a while, though. But that's our subject for today. When do you get competition and when do you not? Now, in some sense, how competitive a market is depends on how we define the good. Remember, we, as economists, we define goods according to the question that we're asking. Now, in some sense, everyone has monopoly over their own brand. That's a vacuous truth. Doesn't really mean anything, doesn't really help us. You could say Apple has a monopoly over iPhones, and that would be inherently true. even if their patent were removed and anybody could make an iPhone, you might still say that Apple has a monopoly over Apple brand iPhones. They have a monopoly over the iPhones that they make. If you want to be specific enough, you can twist anything into a monopoly. However, you would also find that such a market would have an extremely elastic demand, and so the markup wouldn't be very large. It's worth noting that with all of these policy and market failures, well, not really with the eh, not with the externalities, but with all the other ones, the more elastic the curves are, the worse the deadweight loss is. Because the problem with all of them is that they involve some deviation away from competitive equilibrium or socially efficient equilibrium. And so the more elastic they are, the more the quantity changes, the worse the problem is. However, a monopolist understands that the more elastic demand is, the more the quantity demanded will fall in response to a price hike. So you actually end up getting a smaller markup, but it's more destructive in terms of quantity reduction. Sorry, I was kind of getting lost in my head there. Anyhow, everyone has a monopoly on their own brand, but the markup's not going to be super high. The consumer's not really going to care. From a monopsonist point of view, we also have these unique inputs, but those two could be substituted. A producer, a contractor that makes machinery, they don't have to make machinery for that specific business. So you would expect that to be pretty elastic as well. And if we want to go broad with it instead of specific, if you define a good abstractly enough, you can make anything perfectly competitive. So, for example, John D. Rockefeller was infamous for having his monopoly, Standard Oil, on the production of oil. But he didn't have a monopoly over coal. He didn't have a monopoly over natural gas. He didn't even have a monopoly over wood. And so somebody could say, well, he's not a monopolist in the fossil fuels market. He's not a monopolist in the fuel market in general. But that wouldn't be especially helpful either, would it? Because different kinds of fuel have very different uses. So, depending on how you define the good, you can make anything monopoly, you can make anything competition. Um, the uh, the scale of your analysis is just going to have to be bit based on the question, right? You're going to define the good in a way that's the most meaningful. Now, one major factor in determining optimal firm size is what's called economies and diseconomies of scale. Now, way back in the supply lecture, I told you that in production, we tend to have what's called diminishing returns. There is a proper proportion of labor to capital and of different types of labor and different types of capital to one another. And so, if any one of these is held constant, it's going to take disproportionately more of the others in order to increase output. And because of this, we expect production to become less efficient, less resource efficient as you scale up. But while that's true in the short term, while that's true locally, it's not necessarily true in the long term. It's true for a specific production technique, but the thing is, oftentimes you have production techniques that cannot be scaled up or scaled down all that much. They have a certain bit of play, but there is a range in which they have to operate. And because of that, you can have situations where scaling up enables you to adopt a superior production technique, which is more efficient. And this is essentially the story of the Industrial Revolution. It's the story of the modern world. I had a bit of experience seeing this myself because back in college, I worked this temp job. Now, if you don't know, a temp agency, they're a business which basically matches people with short term work. A company needs an employee to do a task. They don't need to keep that employee around, right? They don't need them on a permanent basis. So they go to the temp agency, and the temp agency goes to its employees and, finds them these short term jobs. And one of my assignments was to work on an assembly line making car alternators. But the twist of it was that this wasn't a real, full scale assembly line. See, the company I was being hired out to was actually an engineering firm, not an auto manufacturer. They didn't make car alternators. They made the equipment that made the car alternators. They designed industrial machinery. They tested it, they made blueprints, and then they sold like the patents to auto manufacturers. And so all they needed was just for a few blue collar dudes to go and test run the machinery. They had a quota. They wanted 500 alternators done, and they didn't care how fast we did it as long as we got it done in 3 days. And there were three of us working on it. Now, most of the time we were all working, but some of the time, one guy would have to take a leak, another guy would get a splinter that he'd have to doctor. Sometimes it would just be one of us working. And when it was like that, we had 20 different stations on this assembly line, 20 different unique work places with a specific machine to do a specific task, put a screw on, solder a piece to another piece, drill a hole, whatever it was. And when it was just me working by myself, it was slow. It was so slow. If a machine broke down, I had to either fix it myself or I had to go fetch one of the engineers to fix it, and everything came to a halt. If I had a certain task that I was just bad at, I couldn't, wrap my head around it, everything came crashing to a halt. I had to do everything, and it was awesome. I felt like a genuine craftsman putting these things together. And that's how production was for most of history. For most of history, your craftsman, he works by himself. Maybe he has an assistant, but he's essentially making the thing from scratch with his own tools. The problem is it's slow. I might knock out one of these things in like 20 minutes, whereas you're supposed to knock out 20 of them in a minute when the assembly line's running at full speed. And I had another temp job where I worked in a vacuum cleaner factory, and that's how it was. Now, you add a second guy to the assembly line, and suddenly things start moving a lot more smoothly. Now, if I get hung up on something, he can step in, take over, and I can go work on other parts of the line. We can kind of get ahead on a certain station. If one of us turns out to be better at a certain task than the other, we can specialize. And we actually did do this over the course of 3 days. We kind of became little experts at our own, stations. And we start to get a lot better at this job. And there wasn't diminishing returns in this case. There was actually increasing returns to scale. Because with two of us, we didn't produce twice the output. We were producing more like 10 times the output. And with three guys, it was even better. But if there had been all 20 Chinese on that line, all working at once, that would have been a sight to see. Well-oiled machinery, human machinery just as much as mechanical machinery. The problem is, an assembly line like that could never function with 3 men. The machinery itself is so expensive. The fixed costs of opening a plant like that would be so high that you couldn't afford to do it unless you had it fully staffed. One man with his own tools in his own shop could build a car alternator like that. I told you way back in, I think it was the elasticity lecture. That's literally how cars were made before Henry Ford came along. Ma and Pop's car, workshop, artisanal. One person might be able to tinker away and make a handmade car, and a massive factory with lines running, conveyor belts running, moving pieces from machine to machine, every station staffed can run. And because it is so efficient, it's capable of paying for itself. But you couldn't give tools like that to a small team, because that small team, they might be more efficient, but they're not going to be efficient enough for it to be viable. This is where increasing returns to scale come in. When you're talking about the long term, where you not only have the ability to hire more workers or buy more tools, but you also have the ability to change your entire workflow and adopt entirely new techniques, even build entirely new facilities, then we tend to find that larger facilities are more efficient, dramatically more efficient. And because of this, the bigger a firm is, the cheaper it operates, and it can undercut its competitors, kill them off, take the business, expand. And back in the day, people tended to call this the concentration of industry. There was a common mistaken belief, but there was a common belief that you would naturally wind up with monopolies in all industries. Now, what economists later came to appreciate more and more was the human side of this. So, from a purely engineering perspective, I imagine that several of you watching this will be industrial engineers, so you might appreciate this part. From a purely engineering perspective, bigger is pretty much always better. There are things you can do with scale that you can't do at an individual level. Sometimes you even literally have equipment that's just so big that there's no way to run a smaller batch. You get that with places like steel mills, where they'll have these huge drums that they like melt down the iron slag in, and you can't make a gallon of iron slag. You have to fill up the whole thing or it doesn't work properly. Bigger is better in engineering, but bigger is not better when it comes to the human aspect of business. And unfortunately, you know, business is very, very human. You start to run into what's called diseconomies of scale, reduced efficiency caused by essentially two main things: communication difficulties and office politics. There's a third one. I don't have it on the slide, but I'll tell you about it too. Communication difficulties. I got a formula for you. N times n minus 1 divided by 2, or if you prefer, we can go ahead and multiply that out. N squared minus n divided by 2. If n is the number of employees you have, n squared minus n divided by 2 is the number of communication channels you need in order to keep everybody in contact with each other. Let's imagine if you're self-employed and you have no employees either. You're like a craftsman, and there's a lot of people that still live that way. Well, you don't have to have any communication channels. You might communicate with suppliers, you communicate with your customers, but you don't communicate with anybody else within your business because it's just you. all of your resources can go towards productive work. But now suppose that you want to scale up. Maybe you're let's say that you are a Lutherie. You're a guy that makes guitars, fiddles. We got one down in Pendleton. That's where I came up with that idea. So you decide to get an assistant. And now you have to communicate with that assistant. They have to know what kind of work they need to do. They have to know when they're expected to go and pick up a new shipment of wood and strings. And this means that some of your time spent working is taken away from production. But you only have to have one line of communication, you to him. Then you hire a third worker. Well, now you have to have the A to B connection, B to C, A to C. So you went from 0 lines to 1 lines to 3 lines. Say we make it 4 people. A to B, B to C, C to D, D to A to C, B to D. With 4 people, it's 6 lines of communication. Every line, notice how the number of lines is growing faster than the number of people. Notice how it's growing exponentially, even as your number of employees is growing linearly. As you increase production, a greater and greater proportion of your resources, of your productive labor, is going to be spent on internal communication, internal coordination. Who would you rather imagine that you're in some social group and you're trying to figure out where you want to get to go for dinner? Who would you rather plan with? 2 of your buddies or a big group of, say, 10 people? I think you get the point. This communication problem can rapidly get out of hand. Now, in real life, you're not going to keep lines of communication open between everybody. Because as the business scales up, people's work becomes more and more specialized, more compartmentalized, and so you're able to cut out some of those lines. Firstly, if people are doing completely different tasks that don't generally relate to one another, then they probably don't need to talk to each other much in the first place. And even to the extent that they do, what you're going to do is you're going to create hierarchies and essentially you'll create departments, right? Big businesses, colleges, military hierarchy works the same way. You create groups of people that have a manager, and then the managers talk to each other, and this slims down the communication side of the enterprise, regardless of what kind of enterprise it is, commercial or not. But the problem is this only kicks the problem back a ways. It doesn't change the nature of it, because as you grow, you're still going to require more and more departments, and you're going to require more and more levels. Which means you still get this exponential growth in communication costs. It's just that it doesn't go as fast as if everyone did literally have to meet with everyone else. The problem of the extra levels is also going to feed directly into that second point, office politics. See, employers and customers too sometimes, people in general struggle with a thing that we call principal agent problems. Situations where you are contracting with someone to do a certain task, but that person has interests which are at odds with your own. And so efficiency can break down because because they cannot be trusted and you have to spend more resources policing them, or because you can't effectively police them and they shirk their duty or act in otherwise corrupt manners. As a consumer, a common principal agent problem you would run into is contracting with like a car mechanic, a repairman. You always have this problem that if you're buying a service from somebody who has knowledge that you don't, that they could always cheat you. As an employer, most of the time you're worried about employee shirking, right? You all know that. You all many of you will have had jobs, so you know how it goes. Nobody works hard when nobody's watching. Well, this can end up, especially as an enterprise becomes more and more complex, this can end up taking on more and more refined forms. So you hire managers to surveil your workers on your behalf. You hire managers to stand over their shoulders and watch and make sure that they're doing what they're supposed to do. But who watches the watchman? Who's going to be watching that manager to make sure that that manager is doing what they're supposed to do? The more levels you add, the more room there is for corruption. You also get types of corruption that are not as overtly criminal. I mean, you'll start to run into more and more issues with things like embezzlement, but you also start to run into issues like nepotism, clicks. As a business, in a very small business, the employees do have some incentive to do their jobs properly because the health of the business directly depends on them. And if they don't do their job properly, they might be out of a job if the business fails. You would expect people to work harder in, for example, family restaurants than you would big, fast food chains. In a very big firm, people know that their individual actions are not likely to sink the company. And so they don't face as much of an incentive to behave properly. But if everybody's thinking that way, they call this Peter's principle. If everybody's thinking that way, what if everyone did this? It can end up causing a lot of chaos. You get issues with management who make promotions not based on skill, but instead on who supports their own position. You essentially get these informal political parties within the office where people align with others based around personality. If you're friends with this person, then they help promote you because they expect you to promote them back. Promotion not just in the literal sense of being promoted to another job, but also that you advocate for them, you give them services. If there's some kind of conflict of interest between two different work teams, you side with your own team. The bigger the company gets, the harder it is to police this, the more opportunities there are for this, and it can grow so out of hand that it completely paralyzes the company. It devours so much of its time and it causes it to be so erratic in its planning that the company can no longer expand. This is very often what you see with large firms. They become so large because they're better than their competitors, but once they get large, the quality just nosedives because they're no longer able to hold themselves to a high standard. And I like to compare it to a big fat cat, a cat that's so good at hunting mice that it's gotten so fat off those mice that it couldn't catch another one, even if it tried. These are diseconomies of scale. In every industry, you're going to have economies of scale and diseconomies of scale. Increasing returns caused by the implementation of superior production techniques and decreasing returns caused by office politics, communication, the human side of things. And at some point, these two are going to meet. At some point, the diseconomies of scale take over, and a company reaches a point where to increase production would actually lower its profits. The marginal cost is higher than the marginal revenue. What point that is just going to depend on the industry you're talking about. And it can be personal to a company too, because not all companies are run the same way. But it's not something that economics is really going to be able to answer. It's something that's going to depend on the nature of the work itself. And so likewise, we tend to see that some businesses, mostly manufacturing, lend themselves to very large firms, and some businesses, mostly personal services, lend themselves to very small firms. Now, one particular situation that has nothing to do with economies of scale as such, but one particular situation that often results in a monopoly is what's called a natural monopoly. I'll want to adjust this. For some reason, I forgot to include the term natural monopolies. So here's your scenario. You have a business model where there is a very high fixed cost, but the variable cost is very low. And usually this describes some kind of infrastructure or utilities, things like water systems, sewage systems, electrical grids, and roads. To provide the good at all, to be in the business at all, takes a very large upfront payment. You have to dig the sewer lines. You have to put up the electrical grid with the power lines and the wooden poles and all that. You have to build the power plant. You have to build the road. The variable cost is low. Electricity is cheap to make. In fact, oftentimes you can't really tweak how much electricity the plant makes. It's you use it or you lose it, right? But electricity, it's cheap for a power plant to make. Water is cheap for a water plant to provide. Letting people on a road, well, we already talked about that. That's free. It does put more wear and tear on the road, so in a long enough term sense, there is a cost. But in all of these cases, the marginal cost of letting someone on very, very low. So, what happens if let's say that you have a company that they're the first one to enter this industry in a town. They're the first road, say, in a town, and then someone comes along and builds a parallel road right next to them. Well, the first road might have been profitable before, but when the competitor moves in, they're going to start competing with each other. And they're going to compete it down to the competitive market equilibrium where the price is equal to the marginal cost. But the marginal cost is very low. So the fee they charge is very, very low. In the case of a road, you would expect it to be zero. If you charge someone anything, they switch to the other road. And then you're unable to pay back the fixed cost. You're unable to pay for the construction. And so you take a loss. In a situation like this, the market is only profitable if you have a monopoly. But if you have a competitive uh, equilibrium, it becomes unprofitable because the entrant doesn't just care about the profits they're going to be making in each quarter. They also care about the upfront cost of construction too. If they can't pay back what they put in to enter the market, they're not going to enter the market. So in a situation like this, the first business that establishes itself gets a monopoly, and then nobody tries to compete with them because they know it's not going to be worth it. Like I said, this mostly applies to utilities. And this is why very often you will have one power company, one water company per town, and it's either a co-op where it's owned by the customers, or it's some kind of municipal corporation, meaning that the government owns it and the government regulates it. They keep the prices low because it's not run as a for-profit business. This little picture down here, that shows New York City when electrical power first came along. For a while, it actually was possible to run competing electric companies, just because the technique wasn't efficient enough. They could not provide it for so cheap. But these are all rival companies' power lines. You had your choice of what power company to buy from, and because of that, there were power cables all over the place. They were constantly hurting people when they'd fall. It was a mess. Later on, they streamlined it, and you have one choice. Now, one thing that both the natural monopolies and these high economy of scale scenarios have in common is that in both cases, the monopoly is more efficient than competition is from a standpoint of resource use. A business that has high economies of scale gets that big because it's genuinely able to provide the good for cheaper. Now, it's possible that they might jack the price up after they get a monopoly, but they become a monopoly because they're able to produce more for less. In the case of a natural monopoly, it's not desirable to incur a high fixed cost to build more. Like this down here, that is a complete waste. There's no need for all these different cables. And there would be no need to have two parallel roads next to each other. There's no need to have two parallel sewer systems next to each other. So as long as the monopoly was not exploiting its monopoly power, it would actually be better to have one firm. So just to clarify again, when a monopoly uses its monopoly power to raise prices and cut back on quantity, that's economically inefficient. But you can absolutely have situations where it's more resource efficient or it's more efficient from an engineering standpoint to tolerate the monopoly. But we'll come back to this idea in a while. Now, another factor that determines your optimal firm size is going to be network externalities that we talked about before. So remember, a network externality was like an externality in that your purchase affects other people, but it only affects them if they also buy the good. So your purchase either makes another good, it either makes the good less attractive or more attractive for other people. Now, if the network depends on the brand, and it is the brand specifically that matters. Or potentially we could be talking about like a specific property, like a specific golf course, a specific club. If the network depends on the brand, then you can get a feedback loop where people buying it attracts more people to buy it. Or conversely, if people buying in makes it less attractive, like by reducing the exclusivity of the service or congesting the service, less people would buy in, and thus you're going to wind up with either you get a virtuous cycle, you get this snowball effect of everybody hopping onto one brand, or you get the opposite, you get a vicious cycle where people avoid it, and thus you wind up with industries that are highly concentrated or not very concentrated at all. um this mostly is going to apply, I think, to digital services. You tend to see this a lot with apps and websites. There have been a ton of different social media sites over the ages, yet there's usually only about two at any given moment that people actually use. People used to care about MySpace, they don't care about it anymore. People used to care about Facebook, but then all the boomers joined it, so you cool kids ran off to TikTok. You'll have a specific platform, and the thing is, it's social in nature. You want to use the service because other people are using the service, so everybody goes to the same place. And you might not get a strict monopoly because different kinds of people sort out into different groups. So the boomers and the college kids aren't going to be on the same sites, but you do get a heavy concentration one way or another. This can also happen with services where a greater scale makes the service better because they're able to improve the quality. So search engines, most people use Google. It's not the only one. It's heavily vulnerable to political censorship. Google is politically censored. I've seen it happen over my own life. But aside from the censorship, it's still the best one around. And the more people use it, the more they're able to tweak the algorithm, improve the algorithm. YouTube's amazing for that. I get most of my music from YouTube. It runs by itself. It auto plays, and it's so incredible. Usually, it'll kind of get itself into like a certain rut. Like it'll find a certain genre and just play a lot of that genre, play a lot of a specific musician, but it's capable of these feats of lateral thinking where the algorithm doesn't know why people who like one thing like some other completely different thing. It just knows that they do. And YouTube has never failed me. It always finds like really interesting music that I would have never found on my own. And the reason why the service is so good is because so many other people use it too. Clearly, this applies to multiplayer games. People don't want to play a game that's a ghost town. Uh, you don't quite so much get like heavy concentrations there because games are highly differentiated products. But what you will see is a vicious cycle where if a game can't keep a player base above a certain size, it dies because people aren't willing to put up with empty lobbies. I was one of very, very few people that liked playing Battle Cry of Freedom, a uh, a first-person shooter Civil War game. As you can imagine, it had a hard time keeping full lobbies, and everyone gave up on it. So this will affect your concentration of industry as well. For the most part, dating apps, that's another one I suggested there. In general, you're going to get heavy concentration in digital services, more so than in other industries. And then finally, there's the threat of entry. So if a monopoly charges a higher price than the competitive equilibrium, someone else could just undercut them. Or, well, they'd have to enter first, right? They'd have to start their own business. But after starting their own business, they could undercut them. You wouldn't have a monopoly anymore. And the typical way a monopoly would respond to this is they would temporarily lower their price to try to kill the competition off. And they call this predatory pricing. I'm lowering my price, but I'm only doing it until they're gone, and then I'm going to go back to screwing over my customers. Now, this can work, but the problem is if entry is cheap enough, there's always going to be another newcomer, and they'd have to predatory price constantly, which means it would not be predatory pricing anymore. It would just be typical competition. So if a monopoly is going to prevent entry in that manner, it's going to have some kind of advantage over the entrant. The incumbent is going to have something in their corner helping them. It could be trade secrets. It could be some kind of natural barrier. That this industry is very technical, and it's just plain hard to do this line of work. That's your main reason why most high-paying occupations are high-paying. It's hard to be a lawyer. It's hard to become a doctor. If I had my first choice of an occupation, I'd be a historian. You know how much historians make? Hell of a lot less than economists. A typical historian gets the same pay as a high school teacher. Economist usually makes a six-figure salary. That doesn't mean much nowadays, but still better than the average person. One's a lot harder than the other. There's a lot more people going into economics, or sorry, there's a lot less people going into economics because they can't hack it. And very often, this advantage is going to be governmental in nature. A lot of regulations that get passed that we see when the government introduces new regulations, they're always pitched as being for the good of the consumer, the good of society. But very often they're actually lobbied for on behalf of the very industry they're regulating. Why do you think they would do that? Why do you think that an industry would like to be regulated more? It's to make it harder for people to enter. A big established company is going to lobby to get laws passed that, yeah, it may make it less convenient for them, but as long as it hurts new companies more than it hurts them, they can still win because it makes the market less competitive and allows them to charge higher prices. All told, there is going to be an upper limit on how high a monopoly's prices can be, because if it's too high, it's going to be worth it for the entrant to enter. This also gives us a surprising result. You can technically have a monopoly, yet it not actually have monopoly power. Because monopolies do have competitors. It's just that they're competing against the potential entrant instead of actual entrants. You can have a situation where you have a very high optimal firm size. If the economies of scale are bigger than the diseconomies of scale, if the barriers to entry are also high, that should say high. High economies of scale, so the optimal size of the firm is big. High barriers to entry, so it's difficult for other Mayday, mayday. 1, 2, 3. And we get this surprising result. You can actually have a monopoly, yet that monopoly not have monopoly power. It's technically a monopoly, but it doesn't behave like one. And the key here is that the so-called monopoly is competing. It is a competitive market. It's just that they're competing against potential entrants instead of actual entrants. Yeah, nobody else sells goods, but they could sell the good for less, and so the monopoly still has to undercut them. And this situation is going to come up mostly in industries that have very high economies of scale, so that the optimal size of the firm is big, it's bigger than the market, but very low barriers to entry. Anybody else could step in and do their job easily, do it without much fuss. So the firm is big enough that only one firm is going to serve that market, but the monopoly is constantly fighting for its existence. I'm trying to think if there's a particular industry that would describe. As a rule, I don't think that manufacturing is usually manufacturing is where you've got your biggest economies of scale. I'd say that within manufacturing, if it's some kind of light industry where you're just making little baubles and stuff, you're not doing anything complex like electronics or machine parts. You're just bending plastic and metal into whatever shape you need. That's probably going to be a good example of that. You benefit from that industrial workflow, but any other factory could retool its production lines to make the same thing that you do. Another natural stopping point will start back here.